Hello again, all of you dedicated podcast listeners. Hilton here with episode 8 of TheMossShow. Some usual intro stuff before we jump into the episode. First off, I've started a Twitter account for TheMossShow. It's at twitter.com/TheMossShow, and it's already got a few followers, so go ahead and sign up there. Eric Harlan encouraged me to start the actual feed after our interview on social networking with SharePoint, which should be coming out later this month, so keep an eye on the latest episodes as well, and keep an eye on the feed for updates to the various shows as I go through editing on them. Some SharePoint news. The SharePoint team released version 4 of the SharePoint Administration Toolkit a couple of weeks ago, and it's got some cool new features like the permission reporting tool, which allows you to do things like checking effective permissions of a user or a group, or the compare permission sets option, which I'm going to read this off the post, allows you to compare an object such as a site or a list against its parent to quickly detect which object breaks inheritance in your site collection. So some cool features there and some nice new additions to the SP diagnostic tool as well. So check that out. You can follow the SharePoint team blog post for that, which you can find at shrinkster.com/19j9, or look out in the show notes for this episode. One last bit of entertainment. Somebody sent me a link to a list of 40 SharePoint jokes a little while ago, so I thought I'd drop a link in the show notes for that website as well. But I'm going to read two of my favorite to whet your appetite here. So the first one is the top 3 things a SharePoint consultant won't say. The first is, "You're right, we're billing way too much for this." The second one is, "How about paying us based on the success of this project?" And the third one is, "I don't know enough to speak intelligently about that." So those are 3 things you won't hear a SharePoint consultant say. And the second joke I had for you is, some SharePoint mistakes are too much fun to only make once. So I think I'm certainly guilty of that one. Okay, enough silliness. Let's jump into the episode, which is the second panel discussion that we recorded at TechEd Africa, where we had an entertaining session with Eric Harlan, Zlatan Djinic, and Joel Olsen on SharePoint architecture. We managed to get the big scary microphones working for this panel, so the sound quality should be quite a lot better than the previous panel. So let's go and enjoy the episode.
I was proud and I was standing. I was lost in a crowd. But now this room is abandoned.
We've got a noisy neighbor next door. It sounds like I'm back at home. Okay. Guys, welcome. We're going to be talking about SharePoint architecture. We have a very illustrious panel of some very important SharePoint guys to share knowledge with us. We've got Joel, Eric, and Zlatan. I think we'll go in order. But before we begin, maybe if you guys don't mind, please to introduce yourselves. And we're going to be talking about SharePoint architecture. To get started, maybe let's, Zlatan, I'll pass with you just because you're closer. But if you don't mind, just to introduce yourselves.
Okay, my name is Zlatan Djinic. I work for Business Connection. I'm a SharePoint lead and a consultant, basically. And my focus is everything from pre-sales to architecting SharePoint solutions for large enterprises, and including enterprise architecture to going down and dirty and developing and configuring and deploying solutions. I'm also a most valuable professional for SharePoint, which is awarded Microsoft gives for contributions in that field. And that's it.
I'm Eric Harlan from the States with Joe as well. But I work for a company called Sogeti. No one's ever heard of Sogeti on this side of the planet, apparently. But if you've heard of Capgemini or Ernst & Young, you've heard of Sogeti. It's just another wing off of those groups. In Sogeti, I'm a principal consultant there. I focus most of my time on architecture. Unbelievably, why I'm even in this panel. But so architecture, and I've gone into some team lead stuff. So any basically project that needs to be taken care of, they get some folks in there to kind of start from the beginning and just go on from there. So I've done development to architecture to everything else. So that's me.
And I'm Joel. Hey. SharePoint Joel. Lately I'm focused on upgrade for 2010. So that's like my next big thing I'm really focused on. But since we can't talk about 2010, I'm focused on community, social media. So I'm really into Twitter, Facebook, and the aspects of SharePoint around social. But as well, IT has been my big focus. I was in IT at Microsoft, administration, operations, ran the operations team at Microsoft for the file share and SharePoint deployment at Microsoft. Then I joined up with the SharePoint team and led the IT side of it, so the IT product management side, and that's me.
Okay, so I think let's open up the panel to the audience to maybe ask some different questions. I've got one question that we can kick off with. If everybody's
off limits, by the way, except for 2010.
We've got a few questions there, but the audience can maybe jump in. One question I'd like to start off with, just before we kick off, with audience questions, because I think it's important to get this sorted out up front, a confusion that I encounter a lot, because I think it'll guide the questions as well, to maybe describe or break down the different types of architecture. It's a term that unfortunately gets misused a lot, and in SharePoint it's even more complicated for a variety of different reasons. So does anybody maybe want to pick up that?
The two major pieces in SharePoint I see around it there's the physical architecture, and then there's information architecture. But really the term I think that gets abused the most is actually the term architect. In fact, my title is Senior Architect. It's the best term that kind of describes everything, this architect term. Because it's like, you're not the engineer, you're the architect. It's like, whoa. It's like the Matrix, the guy that's in the room. He's the architect. I'm that guy. I'm just kidding. But what does it mean? I think you have to break it down to the physical topologies and, that aspect of it. But then there really is an information architecture where you get into more of the ECM aspects of it and document management and records management. And that's a totally different ballgame.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I'd add is just like physical architecture takes a lot of planning and a lot of forethought to how your environment's going to actually grow. Information architecture is almost the same. You have to know how your data is going to flow, how your users are going to use that data, and whether you have backup strategies and archiving strategies and those types of things. So architecture on many levels doesn't just stop at a server. It's the planning all the way down to the detailed item. So keep that in mind as well when you move forward.
What I would like to add is more on an information architecture side. What's quite important from my aspect is building of conceptual solutions, and basically what Joel has mentioned already: enterprise content management, document management, records management solutions, social networking solutions, communities of practice, things such as that, taxonomy. You have to be able to recognize a solution that is fitting to the business need, to the business problem, and you have to be able to extrapolate what is the best and guide a client and the actual building of the solution and deployment according to that guidance. Know the policies that go along with it, so on and so forth. Taxonomy is a huge thing. It's usually very easily mistaken by mere extrapolation of site structure, but it's much more than that. It's the whole basically science of classification that is proprietary to every organization, and it's a discipline on its own on how it should be applied and deployed, and that's what I've yeah.
So it sounds like we've got, if we can break those down, there's the infrastructure architecture, or how the servers are going to be deployed. There's the information architect as well, who's going to structure where the documents live and how the documents are structured, things like that. But it sounds like you're kind of throwing a third one in there of a product specialist or a solution architect as well, who might decide, should we be using BDC versus some other capability as well, separate from understanding how the information should be structured.
And I think there's this other role of the architect, which is IT has a specific mindset around availability and high availability, and that's what they care about. They care about the infrastructure being available. The developers, not to defend anybody in here, but the developers care about getting the latest and greatest and hottest and coolest stuff out there, cutting edge. They care about sexy and Ajaxy and They want it to be hot. But so this role of this architect, from a personnel kind of perspective, is somebody who can actually help mediate some of those battles between the devs and the IT admins.
Okay, so let's open up to the audience. Any questions that you've got around architecture?
Would a SharePoint architect be different from a SharePoint specialist and a developer? Because most of the time you find that those roles overlap. Would you separate those roles in a company or in an organization, and what to determine whether you would or not?
I think it's quite important to sort of determine the role of an architect and what is traditionally meant by an architect. And this is the person that has grown out of just mere specialist role. Okay, this is not a person that only knows SharePoint, for example, and a person that actually knows inside out or whatever. That's the person that knows everything else that surrounds SharePoint, everything else that is related to SharePoint. That is the person that can troubleshoot anything else or know how to structure anything else around it, anything that SharePoint even remotely touches. This person should have a more than just proficiency in things such as SQL, in things such as integration, in things such as services, best practices, in things such as very important IT pro concepts like, creating large farms and, achieving high scalability and high availability and so on and so forth. So it goes beyond what actually just SharePoint as a product is and what it sort of offers to the end user.
I have nothing else to add. That was a perfect answer.
Yeah, my name is Etienne. I'm not professing to be a SharePoint expert, but I read a lot of documentation on SharePoint architectures. And in Microsoft documentation, you get Moss central farms, Moss farms with regional sites, and then you have distributed architectures. Can you please explain to me what the differences are, especially when it comes to Moss and the regional farms? Because I talk about intra and inter SSP connections, and it's quite confusing, especially if Microsoft says they don't support certain of those configurations.
Yeah, so let me start at the top level and say that there's three common global deployment types. There's the central deployment type, there's a regional, and there's more of a local type of deployment, where everybody, or your major hubs, there's lots of them, more than 5. So in these enterprises, the central deployment, it's a SharePoint farm. There may be disaster recovery, but it's focused on a primary production environment. And from a SSP perspective, if it's a really large environment, you may even have a separate SSP. And the guidance that continues is the SSP can't be across the WAN. In 2007, that SSP needs to be in the same LAN as all the other SharePoint farms that consume those services. So that's the central. The regional is, let's just take the Microsoft example. HP's looks fairly similar, so does a lot of them. But you have, say, a deployment in Redmond, or at least that region. There's one in Dublin. There's one in Singapore. 3 separate deployments. Each one of them have services, but one of them is kind of denoted as the primary, and so it would index the other 2 farms. From a services perspective, they each have their own services. Then that third one would be, sorry, we don't have enough bandwidth to even consume from a regional one, so we need to have more deployments that are closer to our users. I think what really drives which one it is comes down to bandwidth, comes down to network topologies. As well, there's third-party solutions that can help kind of bridge the gap. The utopia for an IT guy is to have one primary deployment and a decent disaster recovery deployment, along with that. Much easier to manage a single farm and, its various dependencies. Those regional ones aren't so bad. Now you're just managing 3, but when you start managing 20 farms or 50 farms distributed across very slow links, you're not even managing them now. You're depending on other local regions to manage their own farms, and it becomes very disconnected and disjointed. So it gets less and less interesting from an IT or that goal perspective of your utopia where the data is in one place. And I know the next question is going to be around replication. So what do you do about replication? If you're doing regional, right, you're doing publishing, you've got some content you need to push around these other locations. Well, if it is publishing and it's static content, You could go a read-only database kind of scenario with the Service Pack 2 stuff. There's even a little bit of documentation now on using read-only databases. New white paper on the read-only database scenario. If it's read-write content, you're looking at third parties. And there are a handful of third parties that are offered up. Or you're looking at WAN solutions, the WAN accelerator types, to help difference the data across the WAN. That's pretty much where we're at today.
Okay, I'm going to kick off with another question that I've got, maybe related to that as well, is when would you have more than one SSP? So in that distributed environment, you'd have one per thing, but would you have more than one in the same environment, perhaps?
I think the primary thing that drives more than one SSP is the BDC. It's almost the primary thing that kind of drives it. Why the BDC? Because essentially every web application that consumes from an SSP has access to that BDC in any list. So if you're using the BDC, you're probably going to have a specialized SSP for that BDC connection. So that's the first thing that drives it. Profiles as well. For the My Sites, it's a nice thing to have. It doesn't necessarily interfere with other web applications that consume from it. Same with the My Sites. It doesn't interfere. Even specialized search. It really ends up, to me, it ends up being that there is a search scenario, and the search scenario would be, there's some content we're indexing over here, and they have access to it, but we don't want to expose it to the site administrators that may create scopes that contain that information. So it ends up being custom applications that are leveraging stuff that's in the SSP.
There has been a guidance that has been issued around SSPs as well with respect to indexing and search, and there was a number about 5 million items should be per one indexer, and then I don't know, depending on what kind of whether it's a standard or an enterprise edition, you can have 5 indexes per one SSP. You can have 5 SSPs per farm. Does that still hold? I remember that being.
Yeah, there was the 50 million. 50 million. But it is true that somewhere around 5 to 10 million things start to get slower. But when you're trying to index 50 million items, we're talking about weeks of time. I mean, you're measuring your time of indexing that type of content in weeks. So it does end up being a challenge to index that type. So if you can separate it and then bring it together, but the solutions around that are actually quite difficult. I push people into fast somewhere around 10 to 15 million items and say, you should really be looking at fast from a search perspective.
There's also federation.
Yeah.
You actually be using other search engines around you rather than using your own.
And federated search really is pretty cool. It is just another panel from a usability perspective, but it is kind of interesting to be able to see the results together. When you're talking about that regional farm, for example, having a little web part that displays the results from Asia Pac or whatever, and EMEA, along with what's going on in the North and South America. That way it kind of federates it all together.
Yeah, and it's actually, with the federated search, doing that when you have different regional locations, it actually helps with the bandwidth across the wire. So you're not actually going out for each SSP and indexing those regional areas and bringing back that information into that index. You can actually just say, okay, I want this federated location to go out, go to this regional exposed site, and just pull back in real time whatever my search results are. So.
Okay, what next? Anybody else got interesting questions? Yeah.
Hi, can we just maybe talk a little bit about security? I mean, we've got a situation where we've obviously got internal users in Active Directory. You've got some anonymous users accessing some content, but then we've also got user community outside of that, which would be like in an extranet, but they'd probably need to come in with forms-based authentication.
I think, first off, you have to look at this and decide, is all intranet content going to be accessible to all users? And it sounds like the answer is no up front. Or we may be talking about different web applications. And really when it comes down to security really rolls up at the web application level. So you can decide whether it's going to be NTLM or whether it's forms, or whether you're even, to the same data, going to set up forms and AD to the same set of data. When you're planning out your roadmap, don't discount what's going on with Geneva and claims-based authentication. It's the future. It's serious. You need to look at claims in terms of where it's going. Another kind of roadmap thing to look at is look at ILM2. It's amazing the stuff that's going on in that space that's really going to integrate what we're doing in SharePoint and giving much more structure to groups and security groups and our ability to manage those groups and delegate management of groups. So those are two major things I would say put in your roadmap and really analyze those two pieces in terms of where you're going and what you plan to do. But from kind of a brass tacks, what would you do in an extranet scenario? We've got you want to do forms and you want to do NTLM or you want to work with your internal users. It would be just that. Here's our intranet. We run NTLM on our intranet. Here's the extranet. We run forms-based authentication, but we want our internal users to be able to access that content using their NTLM credentials. So we're going to set up a separate web app that points to that same content. You can do some of that with AAMs, but ultimately, don't just do zones. You want that separate web app, so now you know how to manage the users. It's a little bit of overhead, but it'll pay off from an end-user perspective.
Can I ask a quick question? Sorry. What is Geneva? Can you give a 2-minute overview of what it is?
Geneva is essentially claims-based authentication. It's the next generation of what's been going on with ADFS. It's web services-based, claims-based authentication. So the claim is the idea that it's not just a credential. You've actually got a token. You've got a ticket that says you are who you say you are. And that who you say you are could be Facebook says you are this person. So now why not use Facebook for authentication? Anybody can have a claim. It could be the state government, and your driver's license says you are who you say you are. And with web services, it makes it so loose, but so private at the same time. Your claim is only as good as who your source is. You could trust Twitter, you could trust Facebook, you could trust the state government, or you could trust a company to say, this is who I say they are. And so now when you start talking about the future of extranets, well, let's have their company say who they say they are. And so now it's much more integrated, connected, and everything is much more kind of a web services-based authentication type where those who have a claim, you can pass that claim on, and it starts to get pretty technical. And
one thing I'll just add a little bit quickly about the security part of things, and hopefully you'll actually get this theme throughout our conversation, is that there's always planning, a lot of planning involved in everything. And that planning shouldn't be discounted with when you're scoping out how you want security models to go and authenticate against your SharePoint environment. One thing that I come across almost in every single client that I come to is they are already under the assumption that it's forms-based authentication for their extranet that's porting into their intranet. So whatever their external users are doing, they're coming in. But at the same time, they also require everyone to use VPN. So why would you even go through that extra step? Why would you extend out that web app, extend out an extranet, have a whole different authentication model when they're already being authenticated through VPN? And that's the system standard. That's what you're using. So plan for it. Understand where you are now, what your requirements are now, and where you're going to be going. So that's keep that in mind for sure.
Sorry, on the security, as you're talking about, I'm finding that the security model around impersonation in SharePoint sometimes a bit tricky because you assume certain impersonations and you'll end up getting app pools or web user pools. And if you try to use some of the lower-level APIs within the operating system, SharePoint kind of resists on that. What is the best way to structure the impersonation aspect? Especially when you're coming from a forms-based, as you say, internet-facing, into a line of business that's expecting a Windows authentication credential and your impersonation. How do you architect and model that around that scenario?
Okay, without questioning why do you want to impersonate from an internet side, the best way to impersonate is to use impersonation. Now, the thing about that, yeah, it sounds logical. The impersonation in SharePoint is extremely easy. Okay. Another thing is that if you do have, pretty much access to the API, you can impersonate just about any account, which is scary. So there's a security aspect about that. You can go ahead and impersonate a system account, and you can access whatever you like. Okay, on a certain level. There's another thing where you can actually run in code, and this is talk about the code, with elevated permissions. It is not the same. It's a bit restrictive. Okay, it is supposed to be the same, but the practice is proven otherwise. Okay, and usually you would actually use it if you need to temporarily elevate permissions of what you do. So where does that work? It works actually on things like item level permission and all this sort of stuff. So the fact is, if you create a document that you need an item level permission on, you can't automatically strip away everyone else's permissions if you don't have rights to do that, right? And no one really wants to give you those rights because they don't believe you should be having them. However, they want to allow you for that particular functionality to have temporarily those rights. Okay, does that answer? Did I? Okay, great. I just wanted to add about Geneva and all that. I saw you guys, looking around a little bit about it. Do you guys know of a concept of OpenID? And how many of you know OpenID and use OpenID? Okay, like for example, I have a couple of accounts, and it says, okay, we support OpenID, and I go and, there's a lot of OpenID providers, and then I've created it, and then that's, I can authenticate now to this particular service. And then I stumble onto another site, and that was a tweet feed, and the tweet feed goes, oh, cool, I support this authentication provider, as long as you can. This is my trusted source, this OpenID. As long as you can authenticate to him, I will allow you to create a profile on my system. That's the concept of claim-based authentication. You've had it for ages. It's just that it was never really commercially used as it's about to become. And it's pretty much, there's a lot of claim it's going to revolutionize the authentication, or basically the security around applications and around SharePoint itself. I don't believe personally that that's true. It's going to make a lot of very easy to resolve hop issues. You'll be basically, with little bit of effort, be able to authenticate to multiple systems. But things like Kerberos will never go away. And they're talking about death of Kerberos, and it's never going to happen. Okay, the stuff that you guys have been using before, you'll still be using, and there'll be a good reason for it.
It would all be solved if everyone just got a live ID, though.
Guys, how would you position the architecture of SharePoint versus a Lotus Notes Domino architecture? Where would you say you had the edge, if you do think that, on Lotus Notes and Domino?
One of the things the Domino has up on SharePoint is this idea that the client is a replica. We know a little bit about the SharePoint workspace, and that's about where we stop. So it's part of the roadmap as well. But as well, Groove has kind of offers some of that idea that you can replicate your data onto the client. But the other thing I was going to say about this is more around the flexibility of SharePoint around not just the authentication space, but as well the portability of it, and the idea you got these web front ends, and it's somewhat lightweight from a perspective of you're installing in this kind of thin layer on top of IIS. I don't know where I was going with that. Yeah. Notes is definitely old school, and it is very heavyweight on the client. And those replication that actually happens does eat up the network. You're replicating stuff you really don't need. As networks get faster, the idea that the data is on the server and it's the authoritative response, you have a lot less kind of mechanism and collisions and dealing with the collisions and the load that puts on the network. It's this idea of kind of local cache with, say, the SharePoint workspace, but having, say, more lightweight things with, say, looking at the roadmap, for example, the Office web applications, kind of more of a lightweight view of stuff rather than having to pull the documents down every time.
I mean, this more on other competitive products and all that, to sort of, sum it up all, they are great products, that compete with SharePoint on enterprise content management space, that compete with Office web apps that are soon coming out, which we shouldn't be mentioning, or not. Yes, I don't know. Never mind. Delete. Basically, you have leading. If you know Gartner and Gartner's Magic Quadrants and its fourth quadrant, you'll see the leaders that have been there for ages. For at least last 10, 15 years. And experiencing all these products in the past, such as LiveLink and Documentum and FileNet. Things like FYI Identitech that actually went away, and Meridio that still lingers around. They're all great in their own way. A lot of people can argue, for example, that FileNet is by far the best enterprise content management platform. And it's the problem with all of those. And they're like, oh, Microsoft is a new kid on the block. They just came about this, and they actually just got introduced to the whole thing. The fact is that they caught up extremely quickly, especially with 2007. And 2010 is going to take it to a completely new level, okay? On the other hand, one thing that they have and that is dragging them behind is that they've all been built on old technology, on legacy languages, on legacy frameworks, okay, that are not... And they're not doing anything actively to port all of these platforms to new platforms, to new frameworks and to new languages, to utilize new technology. It's not easy to convert those to new standards of authentication, of social networking, and so on and so forth. I mean, something like LiveLink has a language that was proprietary. It's pretty much proprietary, and it's been invented about 15 years ago, and it hasn't changed. The data schema hasn't changed, and it's not going to change soon because they don't have the money to invest into overhauling the whole system because it took them 20 years to build it in the first place. So this is where where SharePoint has extreme advantage, where the rest of the competition is not just slowly falling away, but they won't be able to catch up very soon now.
So you heard it here. Zlatan Djinic predicts the demise of everything else.
I said it in Cape Town. I said it. Oh, Durban.
And you're not Zlatan, are you? Any other ideas, questions, concerns?
Hi team, my name's Robert. Is there a taxonomy structure that SharePoint really doesn't work for? Or is there taxonomy structures in SharePoint that you should just adopt because SharePoint's better for them?
Crickets.
Crickets. Okay. What do you consider about taxonomy? I mean, if you think about taxonomy, you start, do you want to start from, if you look at the semi-structured, unstructured, and structured data that is sitting at the bottom, and now we're talking about, because that's taxonomy is merely actually classification, that's what it is, and then it's the structure around it and how it goes. So you, from the bottom of semi-structured, unstructured, and structured data, you go on to the syntactic metadata, right? Syntactic. Syntactic refers to the syntax, meaning, is this a string? Is it a file? What is it? Is it a binary? Is it, that is the first way on how you classify them. Then you go further into semantics. What does it belong to? What is it being used for? It goes up to ontologies, right? And that's, you have classifications, like you have classifications of animals and all this sort of stuff. What's a phylum, kingdom? Who are the insects, who are the mammals, and all this sort of stuff. So those are the things. That's as far as it goes, and it's a whole, like I said earlier, it's a whole science around, and it obviously pertains very much to the organization, to the way they do business, to the way they're structured, to the way they relate to their own staff, to the way they relate to the clients outside the organization, and because everything needs to be classified. It's not just documents, okay? You might be doing physical object management as well. You might have a bunch of processes. Those processes may become records. In fact, record is a process, or that has been made a record, okay? the thing about the classification, and about the taxonomy itself, and the goal of it is to be intuitive for the whole organization to be able to manipulate it and to get to what they want. So this is the thing. You're supposed to create a taxonomy, right, where every employee in your organization should be able to get to the data intuitively without even having to be trained on the system particularly, just by knowing the terms and what they are. So I know if I click on HR that I might be able to find my leave application over there. Okay, so it's basically learning how your organization thinks and all this sort of stuff. So it's like, oh, okay, so this is probably what the employees would like to see here and what they would like to see here. So it's not just mere structure of your sites and of your libraries or whatever. It's also audiences, client-centric targeting of things. Oh, okay, well, these guys belong to this department. If they go to HR, they're most likely to want to see this, and in this kind of structure. So if they were to navigate through it, this is where they want to go. There's another thing. Taxonomy needs to be built for enterprise search as well, right? Because what is the fastest way to get to something? Plugging into search, pressing search, and hoping for the best result. Why do you have to hope? You don't have to hope. Why don't you just build a taxonomy that is going to make sure that terms that are relevant in your organization, terms that are being commonly used, so you're customizing search to actually prioritize the results that relate to you and to who you are, first of all, personally, as what your role is in an organization, as well as to your organization. So you might want to demote certain sources. You might want to, use things like best bets, faceted search, and so on and so forth to help you achieve things such as like, oh, okay, if I put policy as my first term, it should go under policies and use the rest of the query on the search to extrapolate what I'm looking for and prioritize those results on top and show it to me there. Because I don't want every document in my organization on a farm that has 2 terabytes, to show, that has those words that I've just put in to show up on my screen. No. Okay? And there's also, going forward with that, is what we're going to see in future is search-based navigation. Okay? Or more and more of that. Is if you build a search engine such as Fast, or even with enterprise search. Guys, don't underestimate enterprise. Enterprise search is awesome. I'm a huge fan of it. It's a lot that you can do with it. It's not very user-friendly in some aspects, but it allows you to actually, to change it and to customize it to your own needs, much more than any other, platform that I've seen so far. But something like Fast, definitely, okay? If you can properly configure the taxonomy behind Fast and the way it actually works within your organization or enterprise search, you can use those queries, right, behind the links on the hierarchical structures on your site that people are browsing to. So instead of actually going directly to the link, by pressing, this link, it will actually run a search query and bring all the relevant data. What does that do? It allows you to see all the information that pertain to that particular category as it organically gets added from whichever part of your organization. So that doesn't mean, in order for me to find all these documents, I have to add it to this library. No, it doesn't matter which library I add it to. When I press this button, I want to see everything that pertains to this term or to this gender, and that is that I need to use.
I hope that answers your question.
If not, we can start again. We clearly found something that Zlatan's passionate about. I think search scopes you didn't mention, but that might help out on that as well. But let's give Joel.
Let me tell you what doesn't work. So I'll take it a totally different direction. Well, the things that don't work is the highly transactional and when you've got relationships. Those are the things that start to be, relational in a content type. The capabilities just aren't there. You'd have to build that type of thing. And as well, when you start talking about 5 million items being a limit in a list today, that ends up being somewhat limiting in terms of if you're storing your transactions in a list, that's not going to work. The other part of it is a very large oil and gas company went off and they decided we need to build our taxonomy for what we're going to use. They spent millions of dollars, built a team that interviewed all organizations in the company, and then they came up with the taxonomy. They all hated it. It wasn't what they all wanted. Ultimately, they came up with the idea that our taxonomy needs to be a wiki. Guess what? SharePoint's taxonomy isn't a wiki either. But the idea is it's what does the company need that's going to help normalize and is going to help people find and search and discover information. And it can be overdone, and it needs to be more simplified, but as well, it comes down to the unstructured versus structured data. But there definitely are, just like there's things not to store in SharePoint, there's some scenarios where you're going to have to decide whether you buy some off-the-shelf solution that's going to help you build taxonomy, or whether you're going to build something that helps you do, say, tag clouds and things like that today.
Don't ever store your disaster recovery programs and plans inside of SharePoint. That's the only thing I was going to say with that. Other than that, I have nothing else to add. Those were great answers.
That's a story with a lot of pain behind it, Eric. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, one at the back there.
Hi, I know folders are bad, metadata is good. Now, some clients demand that they want their folder structures just like they have on their file shares. And I know that sometimes you do lose data if you have too deep a folder structure. How deep can you make a folder structure before it becomes a problem in a document library or something like that?
In fact, I'd add to that, are folders always bad?
So, what's the limit? That's the first question. It's about 255, 256, depending on whether you're talking about the URL length or whether you're talking about when a document won't upload anymore. So it's about 256 characters. So essentially, you do need to care about the folder names, because ultimately those are URLs. As well, they can get truncated when they try and put them in linked lists. If you're trying to link to a document and it's stored in a document library that's n levels deep. Are folders bad? For legacy reasons, I think in some scenarios it is important to continue to use them to help people kind of bridge that gap to get documents in there. But the thing that helps us get over that is from a view perspective and filtering perspective, right in the view you can turn off the folders. Now, if you've got optimized queries that have limited items, you can still get decent, performance even on large lists, but they need to be indexed columns and they need to be optimized views. So essentially, from a upload and putting things, bucketing the content in those folders, you can have views that have folders and views that don't have folders, but everybody needs to know when they go in a certain way. But you do have to worry about taxonomy if people are dragging and dropping things through the Explorer view. You got to worry about that.
Yeah, that's basically a taxonomy question. It's always thank you. It's always a choice. They always say, should I use document libraries or should I use folders or should I use sites? When do I use sites for this type of content? When do I use just, when are the folders just good enough, or when are libraries? And that is a huge question. There's always huge debates around that. But the fact is, you will know, obviously, pertaining to the structure of your organization, to the business case behind it, to the way you guys use it, and to the way it actually ends up, being used and being, the way it functions, and then you have to foresee things as well, which is quite important. You have to foresee what the capabilities are, even though that doesn't form a scope of your project or what you're currently doing. You do not want to make it an issue at the later stage when you have to, attach workflows, or when you have to do this and you have to do that. You can, to a certain extent, you can do a lot with folders. You can associate content types to folders. You can do things like that. It's pretty cool, but that's about it. And just so know your technology and relate it to business.
Can I ask you a question on that, Zlatan? What guidance can you, and obviously everybody else, in 3 minutes or less, what guidance can you provide to people on when to use a list versus a library versus a site?
It actually really depends on the business case. It really depends on on what is in foreseeable future. What is the roadmap that the client foresees, and how they're going to use SharePoint? What are the business requirements behind it? So not just what is the roadmap of the technology, but what is the roadmap of the business? Where does the business see themselves? In a couple of months, in a year. I mean, businesses go through a lot of things. There's, obviously there's things that they can't expect and all that, acquisitions and so on and so forth, liquidations and all that. But, things that you can plan for will help you immensely along the way. You'll never have a silver bullet. It will never work like that. But you can always,
No, I was just going to say that, two things actually. One, as administrators or as architects or developers with SharePoint, I find that a lot of folks kind of silo themselves into a specific way of thinking. And with Slatin, what he's saying is essentially, stay flexible as a business needs to be. Don't gear yourself in one particular method, one particular way, and make sure that you plan for building out whatever your taxonomy, whatever your physical architecture is. Make sure you're planning that out in a way that will still allow you to be flexible and not want to bash your head against the wall. When the company comes to you and says, "Hey, we need to change a few things," you have to maintain that there's going to be changes. There's going to be a certain level of complexity that's going to be added or functionality that's going to be added, and you're going to have to address those as they come. So try not to get siloed into one way of thinking, and use the community. There's a lot of community resources out there. A lot of folks, maybe in your position, you've never done any SharePoint architecture. You've never planned these things out. You don't know where the roadmap starts or where it ends. The first thing to do is, figure out what the company needs, what they want the beginning result to be, the end result to be, and anywhere in between. And once you've got that down, utilize the community, utilize Twitter, Facebook, whatever. There's people who've documented this stuff extensively, along with this guy here. And we'll be able to walk you through building those roadmaps and building that expectation of what you're going to come against when those things come along.
So let me get down to the practical level. When would I use a site versus site collection? I tell people, by default, site collection gives you more portability. So if you can start with a site collection by default and then move off of that based on what you're trying to do, then you're going to be further ahead. Because of the portability. He was talking about flexibility, reorg, stuff like that. That's key. Portability definitely happens best at the site collection level. Now you start moving down into list versus site. What you don't get in a list is you don't get navigation to other locations, unless you're talking about like hitting a link inside of a list, right? So that's the challenge. Is if you're trying to plan out structure. If there's different groups that are trying to consume this that have different security, try and keep your security levels as high as possible. Don't try and get that security down into the item level. One, it causes performance issues. Another, it's horrible to manage. But the higher you can manage the security into the sites and site collections, it'll be much, much easier to manage. In fact, if you can keep that again at the site collection level, it'll be much, much more transparent and easier to manage. So try to avoid item-level security just like the plague if you can. It's going to continue to be a pain. The other part is like site versus list. You get nice, fancy UI in a site. So if it's page libraries, then you may want to break things up to give you that kind of navigation and look and feel. You get web parts, and you get the fancy page layouts and stuff for on the display side. So it really does kind of depend on that side. And I think you can ultimately be a coach for the business. The business doesn't know whether they need a list or a site collection. They may continue to default to a list, or they may continue to default to a site. It might be, we need a few site collections, and we're going to strap them together with some common navigation. So try and be a coach as well. Don't let the business dictate and go in the wrong direction. Let me give you one bad scenario. Customer decided, the business gets to decide, they went with one site collection. 700 gigs later, their single site collection, which had 20,000 users in the one site collection because they didn't have any security groups, they're having all sorts of problems because they've got 2,000 plus site groups that they're managing all these users in. Search stopped working because they broke the ACL 64K ACL issue. Windows can't even index the data, and to click site settings and then manage users takes about 10 minutes for that page to render. And they've had 3 different consulting companies in there to help analyze this issue. First consulting company helped them break it into 17 site collections, one of them being 400 gigs. So time goes on, and now they've got, they've pretty much got the same problem. They just spread that problem across those 17 site collections. They're in the same situation. It was never really corrected. And yet the business keeps coming back and saying, you're telling me we need more site collections, but we need this, we need that, and we need these site groups so that we don't have to... Now we're trying to manage site groups across these 17 site collections. That's what AD is for, A lot of it really does require some coaching and guidance so that the business can make the right decisions, so that we'll scale. SharePoint will scale, but you need to do it the right way, and there is a way.
Oh, I just wanted to mention quickly some great resources on the side. SharePoint blog, Microsoft's SharePoint blog, official SharePoint blog, started issuing a really great series of articles called How We Did It, which allows clients with and companies that had really successful SharePoint projects to outline how they did it, how they deployed everything, what it took, and you can actually get some great information there, and you can actually match that to your business, to what the type of implementations that you have and do. Also, if you look at the Technical Writers blog, Microsoft Technical Writers blog for SharePoint, these guys go and pull information from everybody, from experiences from as many people in the industry worldwide, and they create conceptual solutions on account of that, on account of the best practices from the feedback that they got back. And they have sometimes really amazing solutions, and I was really impressed with some of the things that came out. So, look at that. And obviously consider Joel's governance post to go with that.
Well, let's end on that on a last comment, actually. Zlatan, you've given us some nice resources, some things that we can look at. But maybe let's end up with, if you guys, the rest of you, as it gets towards the end, they're going to have less and less to give out. But if you guys, maybe the rest of you want to give out some other good resources that people can look at in terms of architecture and maybe governance and similar topics.
I think you have a top 100 blogs or something along those lines. I actually, believe it or not, I use his site as a launching point for most of the things that I actually need to find, whether it's on his site or not. I hate saying that almost, but that or Bing, obviously, right? Bing's good. But yeah, those are the resources that I usually check, and most of those, if they've made it to that 100 list, I don't know if you were going to go into that or not, but if they've already made it there, they've got some good content on things that need to be found. So those are usually where I search. If I can't find something quickly in like Bing or Google or whatever search, I'll go there usually. So
SharePointJoel.com is the one he's referring to. And there's a post that he was referring to that's top 100 blogs. It's SharePoint bloggers. Planet SharePoint has one that's dynamic that lists about 300 SharePoint blogs that gives you technorati sorting on SharePoint blogs. The other resources I would kind of call out on architecture is there's best practices area inside of TechNet. And Doron and the customer advisory team, we call them the CAT team, they've been putting out white papers kind of behind the scenes. But there's some really good white papers. Just kind of relate to some of the topics we've been talking about. There's a Knowledge Lake, an MCS white paper that talks about 50 million item knowledge repository and how they structured it and designed it and all their test results for building that out. So many hundreds of terabytes or whatever. I'll actually include some of the stuff that we talked about today on my blog, SharePointJoel.com. And I'm going to better address the notes question after I think about it.
Okay, great. I'd like to thank all of you guys for coming along, and thanks for our expert panel for giving some good advice.
Out
If you've got any questions about any of the ideas discussed in this episode, or you'd like to give other feedback, like show topics or requests, then mail us at feedback@TheMossShow.com. To access the archives of all of our shows, browse to www.themossShow.com or www.TheMossShow.com.